Welcome to the Rideshare Guy Podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So Tarani Duncan is founder of Astral Cowboy, a consultancy for last mile logistics, shared mobility providers, and the platforms that power them. She was one of the first hires at Motivate, operator of Citibike and some of the world's largest bike shares. Tarani was also director of operations intelligence at Jump during the acquisition by Uber, where her team developed redistribution software used by new mobility operations teams before doing a tour of duty as PM of logistics at Mapbox. Tarani has also been featured in Forbes. She's spoken at Harvard Business School. She's obsessed with tactical operations, really learning from and loving on what's in hand today so we can build for a better tomorrow. Her current client list includes industry favorites like Zoba, Our Streets, and Tortoise, our buddy. So Tarani also works with institutions like MIT's Sensible City Lab, as well as automakers. So she's doing a lot. And today she's joining us from Portland, Oregon, where she's quarantining with her dog Biscuit. So Tarani, how are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. Yeah, thanks so much for having me on the podcast. I really enjoy what you're doing here, and I'm really looking forward to talking with you more. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. I think I've been working from home for 5 years, so the quarantine, I guess as far as my daily life, doesn't really affect me too much, but obviously it is affecting a lot of people outside the world, or outside my world,
Yeah, totally. Definitely,
so, I think we're getting a lot of coronavirus content, and by the time this goes live, who knows where we'll be at with that situation. But today, I want to talk a little bit about you and your background. Before we get started, though, I'm curious to know, I think I have a good guess, but I'm curious, what's your favorite mode of transportation these days?
I really like dirt bikes a lot.
Dirt bikes. Okay, I figured it might be something two-wheeled. I would not have guessed dirt bikes, though.
Yeah, no, totally. No, an e-bike at this point in time. But also, it's hard to choose because I think we should have a lot of vehicles in our quiver to choose from. Have the right tool for the right job. I have like a little 1994 Toyota Tacoma that I drive as well.
So it's pretty cool car.
Split between my Karmic City e-bike and my Toyota Tacoma, which, you try to minimize vehicle miles traveled on a gas guzzler. But there is a certain amount of delight that comes from driving a tiny around.
So how does the e-bike and the dirt bike compare?
Well, one, I still have an e-bike. I don't have a dirt bike anymore.
Okay.
Yeah. And I think dirt bike certainly nostalgic. I'm from East Tennessee, like near the Smoky Mountains. Okay. When I was little, I got like this little XR70 as a little Honda that I used to putt around on in the yard. And I really think that's kind of like my route. It set me up to be stoked on and open to other ways of moving around, and kind of like freedom that can be accessible through other form factors that aren't four-wheeled and taking up a lot of real estate and kind of over-engineered for a lot of the things that we need to do.
Yeah, so you were really on top of these trends very early on. I was going to ask you to go into your background, but I guess that's a good place to start. You're sort of been doing this from your childhood, and I think that's actually one of the reasons why I really wanted to have you on was because you were sort of a fan of micromobility and bikes and two-wheeled operations before it was hip and before it was cool and before people like me started talking about it. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people have been. The transportation paradigm that we're moving toward today is something that we've taken for granted for a long time. We've had this technology in hand that's been relegated to and, operated under really sketchy and stressful conditions for all road users, which is the bike. And you kind of like inherit cities with kind of wacky land use and wacky infrastructure and underfunded public transportation. And bikes just have been it's kind of like the unsung hero for so long. And it's so funny to see kind of this pivot into being like, and it's so necessary going from like the craze of like autonomous cars, which is kind of like the same old form factor, to what about electric bikes or what about bikes or, So it's been cool to see it evolve for sure. And I think, there've just always been, folks who ride bikes and advocacy groups kind of working to make, public space more accessible for more kinds of modes. And I think that, this whole boom, like the micromobility branding, $5.7 billion of VC funding pouring into the space. It's all been a really good Trojan horse for conversations around how we allocate public space and, why cars for everything? Why not, tools that kind of make sense for the job at hand? So.
Yeah. Well, I'm really excited to get into the details of sort of how, bikes and that interplay between bikes and, sort of what we're thinking about these days of micromobility and scooters and e-bikes and all these cool new form factors. But I think it would be helpful for myself and also the audience to kind of understand maybe I sort of read off your bio and you've done a lot, but maybe in 60 to 90 seconds or less, you can kind of talk a little bit about who you are and what your background is. I mean, I think I have here in my notes that we were talking off air, and we called you an early bike share lady. I don't know if you're okay with me using that term publicly, but I thought that was very apt. So I'd love to learn a little more from your own words.
Yeah, I like bike share lady. I feel like that's okay. That's good. So I was an early days hire at Motivate. Alta Bike Share used to operate Citibike in New York. Back in like 2014, they used to call Citibike, or Citibike was lovingly called in New York, Glitchy Bike. Mm-hmm. and that's kind of when Motivate took it over. And
gotcha.
And I was hired there as an intern. I was doing like RFP work with Alex Vickers, who is also like kind of like an OG micromobility person.
I actually invited him on my podcast too, and he did accept, but he said it'll have to be later. He was on some Amtrak cross country road trip. So
I think he wrapped that up recently. I mean, he was my first coworker, really.
Okay, cool.
The space, and then I moved on to, it was Glitchy Bike. There were a lot of issues with day-to-day operations, and people were attempting to rent the bikes, and having this it was a huge headache. And so I moved on to head up technical operations and all of like the, maintenance strategy and hardware strategy alongside of Tyler Justin and Michael Fruman from the MTA, and Jay Walder was CEO of the MTA, and he moved on to be CEO of Motivate. And that was like a really interesting time, kind of like
very cool.
Exiting college and then working with people who had been in charge of like the Oyster card in London, and head of, CEO of MTR in Hong Kong, just like really
so very knowledgeable transportation experts, basically.
Yeah, and then having to go and talk to them about, well, why aren't people renting bikes? Just like, a pretty surreal moment, and a really cool inflection point in transportation history, I think, kind of pivoting from, this like more archaic, rail system that takes forever to upgrade to more nimble, like, P3 situation. And so then I moved on to work at Biketown and launch operations here in Portland, Oregon. The equipment we used was Social Bicycles equipment. They were a hardware vendor here. And Social Bicycles went on to become Jump. And so I partnered so deeply with folks at Social Bicycles on like day-to-day like hardware improvements and, like doing product development work with them on their back end, that it made sense for me to move on to work with Jump. And I was director of operations intelligence there through the acquisition with Uber. Shortly left after the acquisition by Uber and moved on to do kind of like this tour of duty situation with Mapbox as a product manager, and then was co-founding a company for a little bit, and then just, kind of went out on my own to consult a lot of these companies because there's just so much cool stuff happening in the space. So.
Yeah. I'm curious, in your sort of early days, I guess, with Motivate and, doing the Citibike, but also the Biketown and I guess even Jump, did you have any sort of one or two big takeaways from that time? Because like you said, right, that was sort of early on. It was, like you called it yourself, glitchy bike. It sounded like there were a lot of issues. What's one or two things that you kind of remember from your time on those with those companies or on those projects?
Yeah, I think the first thing is I definitely don't remember Citibike as glitchy bike at all. It was such a blink of an eye situation. We went from, hundreds, maybe thousands of failures a day to successfully facilitating like 70,000 trips a day in New York City on a bike. So I think that it was like,
And that was really sort of the first big kind of shared fleet model of, I guess any sort of smaller form factor, right? Like I even remember, Citibike from back in the day, even though I didn't live in New York, right?
Yeah, no, it was a huge success. It is a huge success today. And I think private public partnerships are really interesting. I think that, me and my partner were talking about this yesterday. It can be a little loaded, but as long as, the success of private companies are tied to specific policy outcomes and, they're, being regulated and, holding up their end of the deal, it can be pretty beneficial. And I think Citibike's a really good example of that. And
why do you think that one works so well, the Citibike partnership?
They have a really intense contract with NYC DOT and really specific service level agreements that are being driven on the city side by data.
Got it.
There's a strong partnership there too. There's a lot of transparency in terms of data exchange. That isn't super loaded because it's station based, so you don't get into kind of the user privacy violations that you get with other IoT devices. So, I think that the P3 model is really interesting in shared mobility. I think it works. I think kind of product development was the Motivate team super nimble with product, definitely not as nimble as Social Bicycles. Did they make a bike and a service are the bikes in Capital Bike Share and DC still out riding around 10 years after they were made? So so there's a lot there. I mean, I guess feel really proud
to me, when I think of, so sort of from the outside, right? Like when I look at a bicycle, it's pretty simple, especially relative to a car, or, airplane or anything like that. But I'm curious, I guess, on the shared fleet side, like when you talk about improvements to the product, like what is that, strengthening the bicycle, making it so it doesn't get stolen or it can lock easier? What kind of, I guess, product improvements are we talking about there with a bicycle that, I guess to someone like me seems simple, but I'm sure it's not.
It's electrifying it.
Okay.
And it's also building, not just a bicycle, but it's kind of expanding beyond, what's the right, is it a bicycle, is it a car, or can we just get creative around the right tool for the right job? And how do we actually induce mode switch in those trips less than, 5 miles, less than 3 miles, less than 2 miles? That would be meaningful for, the livability of our cities.
How did you do that?
How did we do that?
Yeah, as far as induce mode switch, for example. I don't know if you recall any specific examples.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's doing a very good job of that right now.
Okay. I guess that's why I asked, right?
Yeah, no, I think as a whole, it's and I've definitely answered your question more on a macro level than on a Citibike specific level. If we were talking Citibike specific level, we always talk about friction to rental, barriers to entry. Are the mobility hubs in the right place? Is there something about the frame that, is making it so that people are having a hard time riding it? You could kind of dig into the minutia there and figure out what friction looks like. And I think that's in part, what was so compelling about scooters is there's a lot less friction there. You take a picture of a QR code and you go, but kind of back to the macro level answer. I think that as an industry, we're figuring it out, but it's taking all of us together. So you have the Revels of the world with their mopeds that are good for X amount of trips, kick scooter companies, bike share companies, and on-demand or subscription-based car services. So it's kind of this whole ecosystem and just trying to figure out, what is the likely, trip length, or what's, the persona of what's the job to be done, and is this device serving that job well?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually a great way to put it, and I think comes from I didn't make it through the whole book, but the Innovator's Dilemma, right?
yeah, I've never read that book, but I've heard it referenced quite a bit, especially after his passing. So I should check it out.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, but it is definitely not a poolside book. Let's just put it that way. Okay. And so we're starting to talk about scooters, and I think one of the things that I think is really cool about your background is, like we talked about, your early at Motivate and doing the Citibike stuff, and really seeing all of that, kind of an expert from the inside in those early days. And so, what was it like to see this kind of what I call the micromobility explosion? With, I guess, first scooters from Bird and Lime, and I guess this kind of happened around 2018. I guess, where were you and what were you doing when the micromobility explosion happened?
It was actually pretty, I was actually working, I think, to help Bay Area bike share rebrand as Ford Go Bike, and kind of doing this, reconfiguring of their operations alongside of Emily Stapleton and a group of folks from Motivate. And that's when Blue Go Go showed up in San Francisco. It was like around that time. And so, yeah, we saw the dock-based systems kind of show up in 2010s through like 2015, okay. 2016. And then in 2017, we saw the dockless bike shares appear. And I think that our first reaction was just kind of to laugh. Because there's so many degrees of freedom that you introduce when you have a free-floating mobility schema.
Yeah.
Operationally, it's like it can be a logistical nightmare. And then we saw the hardware and we thought, well, like these aren't bikes that are, made like we make our bikes, which would be after X many miles, you change this part. Like we have these wear parts, but the frame's the tank and it lasts forever, kind of like the chassis of a car, or how you would get your car maintained. Like these new dockless bikes kind of appeared. And they were flimsy. If something broke, you scrap the whole thing. You just kind of like put them wherever and just kind of hope that people ride them. And it just felt kind of like initially kind of like a cheap move. That's how but also it's kind of again like a lesson in product design where it's Motivate was certainly more nimble than the MTA. We're not taking like 70 years to show 0 to 1 on a screen. But we weren't doing like MVP, MVP deployment, like testing that, then iterating and scaling. But I would say that these early, dockless bike share companies weren't iterating. They were just kind of blitz scaling and, kind of creating this chaos. So it's, they definitely understood MVP and they scaled their MVPs, and it was kind of interesting to see. So it was kind of like this. It was a tense moment in bike share. I would say they were like the old school bike share folks who are like, we have like full on maintenance departments, and we know like which parts last how many miles or how many trips. And then you have these guys who are just like, we're going to throw this out there and make money. And, from the city side of things, it was really interesting too. And then, in 2018, that's when the free floating electric kick scooters emerged. And I was blown away because I'll never forget this. We used to joke in bike share that we could have our fleet maintenance teams, and like this is alongside of our fleet maintenance teams and in partnership with them, ride kick scooters around to get our field operations costs down.
Got it.
And so we joked about like kick scooters as a tool for maintenance teams, and so it's really funny to see Bird emerge with like a kick scooter as the form factor to be rented. And it was definitely like there was kind of like this old guard, private public partnership, working strongly with cities, third party sponsors model, like building an actual business and understanding the math and figuring out alternative funding mechanisms, and then like the new kind of age of VC funded consumer gadget rental. I think that we were all kind of like, well, they're not gonna last. It's all gonna kind of like burn out because they're not actually running a business here. But I've actually been pleasantly surprised to see, to learn what we've learned. And I think that everyone has a right to kind of explore what they need to explore. And I think overall the industry has just grown so much in the last few years, and it's regardless of my professional opinions about how you should operate a business or how you should seek funding. It's been really amazing to watch it all unfold.
Yeah, and I think one thing that stands out to me from everything you're describing is that there's sort of a lot of ways to operate. There's a lot of ways to, I guess, appeal to your customers, whether it's the form factors or behind the scenes or the public-private partnerships. I guess, is there anything that you're sort of partial to, either for sentimental reasons or just because you think it's the best way to kind of operate or run a business?
I really liked the Citibike model a lot. Are there issues around like exclusivity? Absolutely. There's the whole walled gardens argument, which I'm not super versed in, but I know that it's come up a lot in the context of, Citibike.
And so can you briefly describe, like, what is the Citibike agreement? Like, kind of briefly, how does that work at a high level?
So they're the exclusive operator of bike shared bikes in New York City. They are under the thumb of NYC DOT. They have this really robust maintenance operation. The success of the company is tied directly to specific outcomes for the residents of New York City. So I'm not sure that's the game that, new entrants really want to play, but if operating at scale in public right of way, I feel like you should. So that's kind of like what, and then also like just the sense of there, of course, when Citibike first launched and anytime there's expansion, there's a lot of issues around, do we want this technology in our neighborhood? Who is this even for? But even from like just the level of organization from how, Annie Krasner at Citibike handled liaising with community organizations and making like where the stations go as equitable as possible and as community driven as possible, all the way to you could go up to any bike mechanic and ask how many miles in the field a wear part would last. Like that's the kind of nostalgia that I have for Citibike, because that's not what we're today.
Yeah. So let's fast forward a little today. Do you think that there's a lot of tension between, sort of maybe the old guard, the folks like yourself, the city bikers, everyone who's sort of doing the bike share, and maybe the new guard, like kind of maybe these companies that, some of them are adapting or, taking more of that old school, working with cities type approach. But do you see it as sort of one side versus the other, or do you think people are working together all towards a common goal?
I mean, it's all of that. We're obviously all working towards a common goal. I love that, more folks are excited about the space. There's more money being funneled into it. I think that's a really beautiful thing. I think ultimately we are moving the needle in the right direction because inevitably we're learning from, our successes and our failures. And I would say that there's kind of, this tendency in Silicon Valley and, companies that are really kind of needing or hoping for, VC money to pretend like they have invented the wheel or sliced bread, and kind of like needing that authorship, and like, disruption theory is very different than I think, how people talk about it. But I think that there's probably like a sense of like with the old guard, God, we've learned so many lessons. I have memories biking around at 3 a.m. with like all of the managers from Citibike, fixing things in the field and like getting the system ready for the next day. And that's just kind of like, like this old institutional knowledge, like wisdom you get through actually like the practice of a thing. And it's kind of frustrating for folks to kind of come in and not see that as wisdom, but see it as like, like slow, like not innovative, because we all are working towards the same goal. So I think that there's like with the acquisition of, Jump and Citibike by software companies, there's definitely been, that sense of like the software people being like, well, we're going to teach these like feral maintenance how to run a company. And it's like, well, we could actually teach you all how to make money. Would you like that?
Yeah.
So.
The reason why I asked is because it seems to be a trend that I keep seeing over and over in various areas of mobility that are being disrupted. And, with rideshare, for example, I kind of joke sometimes, Uber and Lyft came in and they completely disrupted the taxi system. But now a lot of the features and a lot of the product updates and a lot of the services and the pricing and the payments that Uber and Lyft have shifted to over the course of 5 to 6 years, it's very similar to a taxi.
Yeah. It's a lot like a taxi now, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's like come full circle in a lot of ways, and that you realize that, for example, like a small thing is when you go to a taxi driver and they might charge you an extra $1 for an extra person or a little bit of extra money for if you have a big bag, or the taxi line that they have at the airports. Like Uber and Lyft are starting to implement a lot of these things. And I see that too in micromobility. So I guess my point is that I think that these new technologies can kind of bring definitely some inherent value, whether it's like shared rides on rideshare, or I'm sure there's some interesting examples you could share in micromobility, but it does seem like the new guard definitely kind of tries to come in and do it their way. But ultimately, almost always they end up not completely reverting, but like going back to a lot of the ways that, let's say Citibike was doing it in the past, because, they were doing it for a reason, right? Like they weren't just doing it for the heck of it.
Yeah,
I'm curious,
totally.
is there anything that you sort of have found as like a good sort of meshing of the two? Are there any companies or any examples you found?
I really love what the European kick scooter companies are doing. So kind of, they're not trying to, when in 2018, when kick scooters were popping off here, everyone was obsessed with the idea of gigging everything out, having people, go and pick up a scooter and plug it in their house. And like, what if there's a failure? Oopsie.
Tarani, I was one of those people.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. Okay. I can't believe I didn't know this about you.
I've tried pretty much every service. So
yeah, that's great. I kind of want to hear, how did you feel about it?
I think that for me, I know when, I kind of got a little bit lucky, just in the sense that in 2018, I grew up here in Santa Monica and Bird was exploding. So I just happened to be in the right place at the right time. And I guess kind of based off my rideshare knowledge of knowing that, a lot of rides are individual riders, 0 to 2 miles. And I think it later came out that Uber said that was about 50% of their trips. But, any driver could have probably told you the same thing without looking at the data. So I felt like I had some insider info that, when these things are working at scale, the hardware is going to be better, they're going to have more density. And long story short, a scooter is going to be, faster, cheaper, more convenient because you can go through traffic, and more fun. And so for me, I was just thinking about a way like, all right, how do I get in on this from the content angle, from what I'm doing? I see a lot of these Uber folks going over there. And when they started the gig charger program, I knew that was sort of a potential way that we could kind of cover it and learn about the company. So that was really kind of my, how I started dabbling in that.
Yeah. Yeah. And overall thoughts, like what was the experience as a charger?
I think that it's very similar. I think in a lot of areas of transportation, especially from the worker's point of view, you're often just getting an object or a group of objects from point A to point B. And I guess in the case of charging scooters, it was from, a bunch of points back to your house and then back out on the streets into the nests that they set up. So I found it actually like very similar to driving for Uber and Lyft. Obviously you didn't have people, but, I think that like that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in, kind of why, I think rideshare is the focus, but I sort of use that as a lens to judge all of these other areas of mobility. And I think like more often than not, they're a lot more similar than different.
Yeah, totally. And I think, they are very similar. And I like what you said too. It's not just micromobility doesn't just transform, the movement of people. It also kind of disrupts or can disrupt the movement of goods as well. So I think that's really interesting. But yeah, so the gig situation is complicated in the same way, except even more complicated than the free floating situation. These operators are introducing even more degrees of freedom. They don't have a lot of control over the experiment. So and they also are creating perverse incentives accidentally. And so I think that companies that are doing it really well now are companies who realize we need more control because we need to gather data around how to conduct our business, and then look at the entire spend and kind of figure out which areas we can kind of strategically chip away at to start, building a company that's profitable. And so I think that, companies in Europe like Tier and Voy are doing really cool things. And I think Bird, stateside as well, is doing really interesting stuff. And I think that, we can talk picks and shovels. I feel like there's going to be more of these companies like Zoba, and Tortoise who are providing services to these third party or to these micromobility operators, including third party logistics companies. So they've basically looked at, what are the most expensive parts of this business? Like what, as our team are we competent on? Like what's our core competency and what should we outsource? And I think that the European companies are actually doing a really good job of figuring out like, just how big of a bite they can take, and then, kind of what they need to outsource to people who can make their day-to-day a little more lightweight and more efficient. So I think, like Tier and Voy and the European kick scooter companies, and then Bird as well.
Got it. So what are those items? We don't have to go into everything, but are there one or two big items that you think these companies can or should outsource?
I think the first thing that everyone should think about outsourcing is fleet redistribution optimization. It's so at Mapbox, I was product manager of logistics. I was working with some of the most sophisticated logistics companies in the world on, optimization issues around, route planning for last mile parcel delivery, and also just, car share companies thinking about where to put things. And, even on a route, let's say you have 5 stops and just a handful of constraints, the number of ways you could run that route, how many solutions there are to that exceed the number of stars there are in the galaxy. It's just like an insane mathematical problem. And, figuring out it's basically like in shared mobility. If the city was a chessboard, but there are thousands of grids, hundreds, if not thousands of, pieces to play with, which would be the mobility devices, and as many, players as there are operators in town. And then, the quality of the move is informed by ephemeral events like weather and traffic. And it's
I was about to say there's external factors, right? And I think I can attest to this, right? Like if you're an Uber driver in downtown, like the tall buildings tend to obscure GPS, and that makes it more difficult. If you've ever been using Google Maps when it's like very, very heavy traffic and it's, like kind of red, the traffic estimates are like way off. You could sit there for 10 minutes and not move, an inch. So it's very complicated.
Yeah, exactly. It's really complicated. It's a really hard problem space, and it's beyond and back in the day, maybe it was sufficient to put bikes or scooters outside of the Superdome during a football game, or outside of the Moda Center during a basketball game. But you're not really able to understand which move is the right move until you take, the spatial temporal constraints of the real world and realities of the real world and plug them into a really advanced mathematical model. Like, you just can't do it. It's beyond, we're not meant to play a game of chess this complicated. We're really good at planning.
So what companies are doing this?
Zoba. So Zoba's doing this.
That's what they do.
And they have a team of data scientists from MIT and Harvard who are just so amazing and smart and kind. And are really passionate about the problem. So it's been really great. They're one of my clients. It's been really great working with them. So, a lot of these companies feel like they can do things that Zoba does in-house. They'll hire, like a head of data science. But that on that person's plate is like, how do we increase our funnel? How do we stay sticky? What's going on with like failed payments and fraudulent charges? And they're like, oh, and while you're at it, can you figure out how to optimally distribute the fleet? And the data scientist is like, no.
What I think what's really interesting is there does seem to be, and I've worked with like probably thousands of Silicon Valley, tech startups at this point, and there does seem to be this kind of like inherent bias towards doing everything themselves, and kind of like building all these products themselves, right? Like not hiring other people or outsourcing or, consulting or whatever it might be. But I think what I really like what you said is that it's more about finding like the 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4 things that someone else that has, great subject matter expertise can come in and do better. Like, how do you identify those areas? So it's interesting to hear that this is one of them. Do you think it's because it's such a complex problem, or what makes this area, fleet redistribution optimization, like what makes that, like what are the reasons why that should be outsourced?
It's really difficult to nail, and to solve the problem, it's a full-time investment. It would be like, you would have to have essentially a company within a company, and
got it.
Yeah. And some companies like Uber, they're big enough, they can afford to make an entire department.
Teams.
But also I wonder sometimes if these giants kind of pitted their own in-house solutions, if they were smart, and, compare their own in-house solutions and the work of their team against these like third-party companies that are super confident, who would win?
No, that's interesting. I think it's a tough, but also challenging dilemma. And I think the companies that figure that out are probably going to be the ones that have a lot more success. Is there anything that you've seen in your sort of experience, or the last 2 things I want to cover with you is sort of, first, like kind of what else do you see companies struggling with right now? Anything else other than, I know there's a lot, but any other big items?
I think day-to-day operations is just really hard for folks. It's really complicated, and you're also generating routes. You're trying to figure out, which mode is right for certain interventions, what percentage of your repair should happen in the field versus in a warehouse. How do you design a vehicle for maintenance that generates a return on any investment you make to that vehicle or its wear parts, and the maintenance of those things throughout its life cycle. I think, just day-to-day operations and how much that's informed by vehicle design is a really difficult lift for these companies. So I think we're going to see a lot of folks kind of pivoting to like direct to consumer. I think we're going to see folks, becoming more of like a picks and shovels business, or we're going to see folks running out of runway or getting other injections from VC and still kind of struggling in the same ways over and over again.
Yeah. Are there any, I guess, companies in that picks and shovel space, or I guess any opportunities you see out there? I know you mentioned Zoba and Tortoise, who I've had Dimitri on the podcast. I like that business a lot. Actually invested in the company after I interviewed him. So definitely a big fan of Tortoise. What opportunities are, I guess I like that picks and shovels term, but because that's sort of what I do from the content side, but curious to know what you think.
Yeah. And it's kind of what I'm doing on the consulting side now too.
Yeah.
It's kind of like hedging my own risk and not knowing, which star to hitch my wagon to, because it's such an intense time in the space. But I think third-party logistics companies are actually going to have a come up in the next few years. Just like, how do we maintain these fleets and run out daily operations as cost effectively as possible? So I think that we might see, that happening where, there's maybe a core team of folks who are, this company, like Tarani's scooter company is full-time, part-time employees, seasonal employees, whatever, but that their efforts are kind of being supplemented with this third-party logistics company or coordinated alongside of, and then kind of slowly, chipping away at, well, what can we outsource to them versus what we can bring in-house, and finding the right balance. And a lot of this, I guess, that I would say is missing from this industry is just basic accounting and basic business problem solving, because everyone's so intent on fundraising right now that they're not really running businesses. They're running like horse and pony shows. So I think third-party logistics companies, though, have a lot of potential here. And especially if we're talking about the disruption of movement and goods, it could get pretty interesting there.
Yeah, it does seem like, I think, I've really enjoyed our conversation. It seems like that, if I'm out there and I'm looking for opportunities, or if I'm an entrepreneur looking to start something in this space, it does seem like the thing that a lot of, especially the companies that are coming at it more from the VC, the tech side, so that might be more like the Birds and the Limes. It seems like they run into the most issues when it comes up against like real world problems. Like a lot of things you're talking about are like redistribution, optimization, logistics, operations. That's like getting out into the field and, like you said, 3 a.m. driving around, getting these scooters, getting your hands a little dirty. And this was something I noticed in my experience as a Bird charger, was that early on, I felt like a lot of the actions that companies wanted you to do, it was sort of like, hey, be like a good, like do this out of the kindness of your heart. Like go over to this scooter and find it out of the kindness of your heart, as opposed to like paying me more as a charger for doing it. And like how I know gig workers, like they're not incentivized in the same way as, an employee who has equity or that's working, very hard for different incentives. And so it does seem like that
free lunch and snacks and
exactly,
in a cushy
right?
office and is like a salaried employee.
Yeah, it's like a very different sort of, incentive structure, but also just type of worker, and, their motivations are going to be different. You have to really understand them. That's sort of where I've come in the past, is, bridging that gap. But it does seem like I like that idea of, these third-party logistics companies. I know there's, lots of companies providing, everything from like charging space to, like bicycles that go out and collect scooters. And it seems like a lot of those opportunities are very interesting in the future. So I appreciate, I do want to, wrap things up though, and kind of ask, just kind of close things out with a little bit more. You mentioned the work that you're doing. Do you want to share how you're working with companies or things that you're interested or looking to towards the future?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm really excited right now about working with, shared mobility operators on helping them with their day-to-day operation strategy when they're ready to come to the table and talk about those things. Right now it's, maybe not we'll see. I'm not sure, where some of these companies are in regards to that. I'm also working with companies on product development, technology transfer for some, colleges and like transportation labs, and working with automakers. There's a big pivot here that's happening, and my favorite clients right now are last mile delivery companies and automakers.
Interesting.
So that kind of work is the work that I'm most excited about. But yeah, I would say I love operations. I love being in a work environment where you have PhDs working alongside of folks with wrenches in their hands, who have benefits, who have a full-time job, who love what they're doing because it's resourced and people understand inherent value and execution and maintenance. When people are ready to get serious about operations, I'm here to talk to them about it.
Yeah. And it also, one thing I've noticed, since I've been kind of covering the rideshare world for, I guess now like 6 years, there seems to be, we talked about that full cycle of, coming back to the industry you disrupted, but also it's a lot of times, the right ideas, sort of sometimes just need the right timing. And so I'm seeing companies or, ideas or products or startups, come out now that I've seen before, but I think the timing is a lot better now. So I imagine too, it would be really valuable to have someone like you on their team, because you kind of know what everyone's tried before, and you're kind of like an almanac. If someone needed the history of micromobility or bike share, you'd probably be the person to talk to. So I don't know if that's as sexy of branding, but I might think of you that way as a resource in the future.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, I agree. That's right.
Very cool. So if people want to get a hold of you, I know you're on Twitter. What's the best way they can find out more about your work or follow you or get a hold of you?
Sure. So I'm at Twitter at Tarani Duncan, and I have a website for my company. It's astralcowboy.co. That's ASTRAL cowboy.co. So there's more information there if they want to reach out.
Very cool. And we'll leave a link to that in the show notes. And I just want to say, Tarani, I think that's the first time I pronounced your name right on this whole podcast, but I think I got it right finally at the end. I'm going to keep practicing and appreciate you coming on. We'll definitely stay in touch and look forward to seeing what you do in the future.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me.